between Israel and Hamas. Officials have now confirmed that 2 American hostages have been released. They are Judith and Natalie Renan, a mother and daughter from Illinois. They were kidnapped along with about 200 other people during that Hamas terror attack inside Israel just about 2 weeks ago, according to Israeli officials. They are now safely back in Israel. The White House has just put out a statement. I want to get to our Gabe Gutierrez, who is at the White House while we wait for the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, to come out. And Gabe, the president in this statement making some news here, indicating there are other American hostages being held by Hamas, and that he had a phone call with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. President Biden speaking with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier today, discussing how they will be able to secure the release of more hostages. But that written statement, as you mentioned, coming out just within the past few minutes, and in it, the president says our fellow citizens have endured a terrible ordeal these past 14 days, and I'm overjoyed that they will soon be reunited with their families. And he goes on to further say, I thank the government of Qatar and the government of Israel for their partnership in this work. Jill and I have been holding close to our hearts all of the families of unaccounted for Americans. Again, Hallie, that breaking news, those 2 hostages that are released. And we just heard from President Biden about working with the Qatari government was able to secure their release. Now, this comes, Hallie, after a whirlwind week from the president, where just yesterday he spoke here in the Oval Office at just his second Oval Office address of his presidency, talking about the need for more funding for not just Israel, but also Ukraine, and linking those 2 wars as vital to U.S. national security. But for the Biden administration, this is certainly news that they have been waiting for, the release of 2 American hostages. So far, 32 Americans have been killed in this war. 11 other Americans remain unaccounted for. Hallie?
Gabe, thank you very much there, live for us on the White House North Lawn. I want to go now over to the State Department, where our own Chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, is there inside the room where we expect to hear from Secretary of State Blinken really any minute now. Andrea, we know that these hostages have been released now, these 2 women. We know that they are safe in Israel at this point. What we don't know is anything else about the negotiations to get them out. I have to imagine that is going to be something that you and the other reporters there will press the Secretary of State on.
That's a great question. That's exactly what we're going to be asking. Hallie, the interesting sentence in President Biden's release, his statement from the White House, was that Qatar, the country of Qatar, in partnership with Israel, he thanked them in partnership with Israel, meaning that this was, from the American perspective at least, both Qatar and Israel working together to make this happen. And just going back a few days, just a week ago or 6 days ago, the Secretary of State was on that shuttle diplomacy, going to Qatar, going to Saudi Arabia, going to Egypt, and, back on front end and back end Israel. That's what the focus was. He said that the primary focus, the top priority for the president and the secretary, were the release of the American hostages. One of the problems, the challenges, they did not know how many Americans were being held hostage. They knew how Americans were missing, some of, as you know, more than 30 dead, but they didn't know how many of the missing were actually held, alive and held, or hostages who might tragically have been killed once they were in Gaza. So the numbers were not known, but clearly with the help of the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, and that was one of the things that we're all pushing for. In fact, just earlier today, in talking to Martin Fletcher, before he knew that, in fact, it's now been confirmed that it was his relatives, these 2 women, Judith and Natalie Renan, who were released, he said, we've got to get the Red Cross into it because it is the rule of law. The law of war is that the Red Cross should always have food and contact with hostages during wartime and make it possible for them to talk to their families. And that had not been possible through all this time. So, Hallie, we're waiting for the secretary, but he was in the middle of all these negotiations. And then, of course, in Israel with the president, they were supposed to go to Jordan and enlarge and improve upon the relationship with the Arab leaders. And that, tragically, was impossible when the Arabs canceled their decision to meet with the president as he was driving in the motorcade to leave for Israel and Jordan, as you know. And it was because of the bombing that was the U.S. and Israel say erroneously laid at the feet of the Israelis. We have no way of confirming who was responsible, but The U.S., as you know, have released intelligence and are considering declassifying more intelligence. But by the time the U.S. confirmed that, and the president said it in his speech last night, and the Israelis said it about an hour and a half after Hamas had announced that it was Israel who was responsible, the Arab street, the region was aflame, and the Arab leaders, feeling vulnerable, chose to say that they could not accept a summit with the president at that time. That's what the balancing act that President Biden was trying so hard to perform when he went to Israel, to also go to Jordan, to meet with King Abdullah and al-Sisi of Egypt, to meet with the other leaders, of course, with Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian side, from the West Bank. And that is now not possible in person. They're going to try to put something together to try to retrieve that. And I should also point out, Hallie, as you know, that bipartisan Senate delegation has left, I guess, left last night for the region and is going to Saudi Arabia as well as Israel. We don't know other destinations, but with Lindsey Graham and the leadership, the co-leadership of that, and a number of Democrats, Senator Booker and others on that delegation, they are trying to pursue the larger goal of a larger peace and negotiation between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which we thought, frankly, was really in jeopardy because of the outbreak of war. Hallie?
Andrea Mitchell, live for us there at the State Department. Andrea, thank you. I know you will stand by. I want to bring in now our NBC News foreign correspondent, Josh Letterman, who's live for us in Tel Aviv. And Josh, with preemptive apologies, because we will interrupt you if the Secretary of State comes out, we have heard now from the Israeli military. We have heard from the White House. We're about to hear from the State Department. And now I understand we are hearing from Hamas. Tell us more.
That's right, Hallie. We are hearing from Hamas in a new statement that they have just released, in which they say, "We stress that we are working with all mediators to implement the movement's decision to close the civilian file if appropriate security conditions are available." So that is a bit of a cryptic statement, but just to read between the lines a little bit here, when Hamas talks about closing the civilian file, they are alluding to releasing all of the civilians who are in their custody, because over the last several days, we have heard from Hamas in different venues suggesting that they were open to releasing these civilians who were brought into the Gaza Strip during that terror attack, while saying they have no intention of releasing the Israeli troops who they captured and are now hostage. Hamas making clear that would have to be some type of a prisoner swap with the Israeli government, but they have suggested openness to releasing civilians. And when Hamas talks about if appropriate security conditions are available, that appears to be a reference to the kind of ceasefire that Hamas has been demanding. We heard from our own Richard Engel, who reported recently that Hamas was open to releasing all of these civilians in as little as an hour if only Israel would stop the airstrikes. For various reasons, the Israelis said that that was not going to be possible, and we did not see any progress on it. But we clearly have seen messaging from Hamas making clear they are open to releasing from their control additional hostages beyond these 2 Americans who have been released today. But they don't want to do that until they see Israel pull back from the continual airstrikes that have really bombarded the Gaza Strip over the last 2 weeks. We're also hearing in a new statement from the Red Cross describing their role in this spectacular prisoner release of these hostages over the last few hours. The Red Cross saying it was their aid workers who actually escorted these 2 American citizens from Hamas custody to the Israel-Gaza border, where they were then met by those Israeli officials. The Red Cross, they are also calling for immediate access to the remaining hostages, saying that the Red Cross is fully prepared to go and to observe their condition, provide whatever assistance they can. That speaks to a demand that both the U.S. government and the Israeli governments have made, that they are insisting that the Red Cross have access to the remaining hostages that are currently in Hamas custody in the Gaza Strip. Hallie?
Josh, thanks. I want to bring in now our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who is also live for us on the ground in the region now. And Richard, one of the things that you are hearing, as Josh laid out in that Hamas statement, was the idea that necessary security conditions would need to be met in order to release other hostages beyond simply these 2 Americans who have been released so far. At the same time, we saw Israeli airstrikes continuing even with the release of these first 2 hostages. What does that say to you?
Well, Hamas is effectively saying that these two were the exception, that these two were released for humanitarian reasons, but that they are going back to the same position that they told me several days ago, that they are willing to release more hostages, but they want the airstrikes and other attacks against the Gaza Strip to stop. Several days ago, Hamas initially made this offer. The chief spokesman for the military wing made a proposal saying initially that Hamas would release all foreign hostages, that is Israeli Americans, Israeli Germans, any other dual national, from their custody if these, quote, security conditions were right. We were able to get in touch with the senior Hamas leader and ask him what that meant. And he told us that it meant that Israel must stop its airstrikes in order to allow Hamas to release its hostages. We saw just over the last several hours, Hamas released two of its hostages, this mother and daughter Israeli Americans. And now Hamas, just a short while ago, is clarifying its position, going back, if you will, to the original position that it told us, saying, yes, it is still willing to release others. It is still willing to release civilians and dual nationals. That wasn't spelled out in this latest statement, but that has been the position that Hamas has told us, if the airstrikes stopped. So we will see if this does lead to more, or if this is just a negotiating tactic from Hamas. We are in contact. I'm in contact directly with some of the negotiators who are dealing with Hamas, who are trying to free the rest of the hostages, and they are optimistic. It is a difficult process. They are not getting much sleep. They have been working on this for the last several days straight, but they hope that this is, quote, just the start.
This is a critical diplomatic moment here, Richard, as the work continues, this scramble to try to see if more hostages can be released. What will you be listening for, and what will leaders in the region be listening for when Secretary Blinken takes to that microphone just minutes from now?
I think they are going to be looking for a broader statement. Does this moment open up a chance for dialogue? Does this moment open up a chance to ease some of the pressure on Gaza, ease some of the pressure on the 2.3 million people who are inside Gaza, who are under attack? Many civilians are dying. Many Hamas leaders are being killed. But for the people who live in Gaza, there is an extraordinary humanitarian crisis that they are going through right now. It is putting pressure, obviously, on the people of Gaza, obviously on Hamas, but it also has this entire region on edge. There is a deep concern from Cairo to Jordan to Qatar and beyond that we could be at the gates of a new massive regional war that the Middle East does not want, a war that could drag in the United States, which the United States does not want, which is why the United States is trying to deter Iran and other actors from taking advantage of this moment to escalate this. That is why Middle Eastern leaders are pressuring Hamas to free some hostages so that there will be relief for the people of Gaza, and so that this region does not once again spill into the chaos of an all-out war.
Richard, thank you. I'll ask you to stand by while we bring in Jeremy Bash-now, former chief of staff at both the CIA and the Department of Defense and an NBC News analyst. Jeremy, as we have learned more over the course of the last 90 minutes as to how this particular hostage release unfolded, these two women, again from Illinois, being released now in Israel, what is standing out to you? What feels most significant to you about how this process played out?
Well, I mean, it's a crack. It's a crack in the efforts by Hamas to show. I think they're trying to show goodwill. I don't think it's going to go very far, though. I think you'll hear from the Secretary of State appreciation for Qatar's efforts. I think you'll hear appreciation for Israel's efforts. But fundamentally, I think you're going to hear the same posture from the Secretary of State that you heard from the president, which is that we're not going to rest. We're not going to stop until all hostages are released. Certainly, the American hostages are our highest priority. And I don't think it's going to stop Israel from launching its offensive, its counterterrorism operations against Hamas. And so, this call for a ceasefire, which Hamas has been sort of saying to Richard Engel and saying to the international media, I think it's in some respects a non-starter. Now, the only thing that's sort of going through my mind, Hallie, is that I do think that there were probably voices inside the Israeli military establishment saying that the hostages' presence there is really a complication for our operations on the ground. We certainly don't want to inadvertently kill our own people. And so if, in fact, there's some larger scale deal very soon to get all of these hostages out of harm's way, maybe from the International Red Cross, maybe from Qatar, maybe from others, then we should take that deal, hold off for a few days to try to get that, because that will give us a freer hand down the road to go into Gaza and take out Hamas without worrying about where the hostages are. So that might be part of the calculus, but I think by and large, this is great news for the Ra'anan family. This is a small bit of good news, as I said, a crack in Hamas's resistance at this point, but it's really not much that the Israelis are going to use to sort of hold off on their military counterterrorism operations.
For Judith and Natalie, the two Americans who've been released, Jeremy, this is obviously an incredibly intense, emotional moment for them as they are really reacclimating to what it's being like now, not under duress. There is also an opportunity to debrief them on what they saw while they were in Gaza, while they were being held by Hamas here, right?
Yeah, they'll be quickly but carefully debriefed by Israeli Shin Bet, Internal Security Service officials. They'll want to know, did they overhear any names? Where physically were they held? What were the conditions? What was the equipment that the captors had? What phones did they talk on? What was their general pattern of life during the day? Were they moved around? Were they talking to other people who were holding hostages? So, all along the way, the hostages had an opportunity to observe what their captors were doing, and assuming they were, trying to pay attention, trying to memorize details, trying to listen for certain things, that information is going to be fresh in their minds, and the Shin Bet is going to want to very carefully debrief them. Obviously, they're going to be sensitive to their health condition. They're going to be sensitive to not forcing them to relive the horrors of the last 12 days. But this is going to be very actionable intelligence that Israel will be now in possession of.
Jeremy, thank you. On the left side of your screen, you may have noticed there our correspondent Andrea Mitchell in the room at the State Department taking a seat, an indication that we are getting close now to hearing from the Secretary of State. I want to go back to Richard Engel. And Richard, just briefly here, as we do expect the Secretary to come out, there has been discussion now about just how imminent any kind of ground incursion by Israel would be. This obviously changes some of the calculation here, presumably for the Israelis.
It has the potential to do that. I think that Jeremy Bash is right, that Israel is not going to stop its military campaign. It is not going to stop its airstrikes. But there is another component to all of this, which is the ground invasion. Israel has tanks and troops built up all along the border with Gaza. There have been indications over the last several days that Israel was going to go in imminently. If Israel rolled in to Gaza now heavy with this new information, as it is still debriefing the hostages, or the new freed hostages, about the whereabouts of other Israelis, of other Americans in there, I think it will probably give the Israelis a moment of pause before they send in the heavy armor. I think they're going to want to learn whatever intelligence they can first and see if there is a possibility to free the other hostages. But that does not mean they will ease up on their campaign to continue to target Hamas leaders with airstrikes, attacking from the sea, commando raids. I think this campaign continues, but it might change the calculus for sending in the tanks.
You make an important point, Richard, that even as late today, after word of this hostage release, the Israeli military made clear that they would gear up now for the next phase of this war, Richard.
They are gearing up, and they have been saying that, and that is part of the pressure campaign. They have been attacking Hamas from the air, and they have these troops build up. That has gotten the Arab world's attention. That is one of the reasons that the Arab states are pushing against Hamas, because they don't want to see the Israelis go in heavy and trigger a much larger regional war. So Hamas is under pressure from the outside. It is also under pressure from the Palestinian people, who are paying an enormous price. Hamas wants to remain popular in Gaza. It claims that it is representing not just the people of Gaza, but the Palestinians writ large. Many people in the the Arab world are ashamed of what Hamas did. It has made it difficult to defend the Palestinian people. It has made it difficult to defend their legitimate struggle that has been reaffirmed time and time again by the United Nations. Hamas has made the Palestinians look bad. And that is one of the reasons I think that so many Muslim countries are trying to pressure Hamas to show goodwill, to have these gestures. But we will see if this is just the start, if now Hamas's price for the others go up. There are so many things that could go wrong. But over the last 12 days, we have only heard bloodshed.
I've got to interrupt you
and now
because we're
we will hear from the
listening
Secretary.
in here to the Secretary of State.
Since October 7th, were released. These two Americans are now safely in the hands of Israeli authorities in Israel. We expect a team from the U.S. Embassy to see them very shortly. Over the coming hours, they'll receive any support and assistance they need. And of course, we're very anxious to be able to reunite them with their loved ones. We welcome their release. We share in the relief that their families, friends, and loved ones are feeling. But there are still 10 additional Americans who remain unaccounted for in this conflict. We know that some of them are being held hostage by Hamas, along with an estimated 200 other hostages held in Gaza. They include men, women, young boys, young girls, elderly people from many nations. Every single one of them should be released. Since the earliest hours of this crisis, the President has made clear that he will do everything possible to secure the release of every hostage. During my own recent travel to the region, I emphasized the urgency and importance of this to the United States and pressed our partners to do everything they can to help us secure the release. Since that time, we've continued to work relentlessly with partners to do just that. I can't speak publicly about the details of these efforts. I know you understand that. But the urgent work to free every single American, to free all other hostages, continues, as does our work to secure the safe passage out of Gaza for the Americans who are trapped there. In this particular instance, I want to thank the government of Qatar for their very important assistance. When I was in Israel last week, I met with the families of U.S. citizens that Hamas has taken hostage. President Biden, too, had the opportunity to hear directly from the families. It's impossible to adequately put into words the agony they're feeling of not knowing the fate of their loved ones. Worrying relentlessly about them, for their safety, for their security, for their well-being. No family anywhere should have to experience this torture. What I shared with the families, as the President did as well, is that the entire United States government will work every minute of every day to secure their release, to bring their loved ones home. They have my solemn pledge, those who continue to have loved ones held hostage by Hamas, that we'll continue to do that, working as though these family members were our own. With that, I'm happy to take a few questions.
Mr. Secretary.
Well, thanks for coming down, Mr. Secretary. I'm just, you said you couldn't talk about specific details, but I'm wondering, you did thank the government of Qatar, and I'm wondering, since you were there, and they have an office, they host a Hamas office, if you could elaborate a little bit on what their role was, and if you continue to think that that channel there, them having an office there, is worthwhile. And then secondly, a lot has been made by you, by the President, by other officials about how it is important for Israel, once, if and when it begins a ground incursion into Gaza, for it to respect the rules of war international. And I'm curious if you think that to date, even before that ground incursion has started, if Israel is respecting those rules and laws. Thank you.
Matt, thanks for the questions. You'll understand that because this is an ongoing effort to get Americans who are hostage in this moment in Gaza out, to secure their release, to get them back with their families. I really can't go into any details about what we're doing, how we're doing it. And all I can say with regard to Qatar is, in this instance, we very much appreciate their assistance. Beyond that, I really can't say, because again, we want to focus on making sure that we're getting those who remain hostage back home and with their loved ones. That's the single most important thing. With regard to how Israel is conducting its operations, I think you've heard the President speak to this very clearly. You've heard me speak to this very clearly. We've said, we believe strongly that Israel has not only the right, but the obligation to defend itself against it's very hard to put into words, the nature, the barbarity of the attacks. And they really do have the obligation to defend themselves against it, to do whatever they can to try to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But we've been very clear as well that the way Israel does this matters, and in particular, it's important that operations be conducted in accordance with international law, humanitarian law, the law of war, as applicable, and that everything be done to minimize the loss of civilian life. And we continue to focus on that, just as we're also focusing on getting assistance into people in Gaza who need it. There will be plenty of time to make assessments about how these operations were conducted, but I can just say for the part of the United States that this continues to be important to us. And again, it's what distinguishes us, distinguishes Israel from terrorist groups like Hamas, which not only have absolutely no concern for innocent human life, they intentionally use innocent human lives to hide behind, to use as, quite literally, as human shields, knowing that civilians invariably are going to suffer in conflict.
Thanks.
Mr. Secretary, just following up on that, Hamas has issued a statement through Abu Abaida, and I know with the huge caveat that it's a terror group and one does not attach credibility to that, but they have said that all the hostages, the civilian hostages, which include the Americans, could be released, that this could be the start of something bigger if there are no airstrikes. Would this be a moment where, if under Israel's discretion, obviously, it would be wise to pause, to give it more time to see if this is a moment, since the ground invasion has not started, should even the airstrikes be stopped, to see if you could get more people out? And it was notable, without going into details, that in the President's statement he said he expressed his thanks to Israel, to Qatar rather, in partnership with Israel. A notable connection there. The obvious inference is that they were working together on this. Does this give you hope that, despite everything that's happened, that there could still be a broader relationship and avoid a wider war?
Thanks, Andrea. So, two things there. First, it's very simple. Hostages should be released immediately and unconditionally. That's been our position from day one. It remains our position. And to your point, I would not take anything that Hamas says at face value. I'm not sure anyone in this room would take at face value or report something that ISIS had said. Same applies to Hamas. Our position is clear. Every hostage needs to be released, and needs to be released now. There is no doubt from my own travels in the region that one of the important things throughout this this very difficult period, and since the attack, the unconscionable attack by Hamas, is to continue to find ways for countries to cooperate, coordinate when it's in their interest to do so. And we'll continue to look to that. Any cooperation that we can elicit that facilitates the release of hostages, any cooperation that we can elicit that secures the provision of humanitarian assistance to the men, women, and children in Gaza who so desperately need it. We work on that every day. And I think we can say that we've seen some of that cooperation. The broader question, though, I think is usually important, because what's abundantly clear is the vast majority of countries, the vast majority of people want the same thing. They want a region where countries are working together, where relations are normalized, where there's greater integration, where people are working together, studying together, traveling, doing business. The overwhelming majority of people want that. And we want to see as well the rights and aspirations of the Palestinian people fulfilled in the context of that kind of region. And that's one vision, and it remains very much alive in every conversation that I had. The alternative is equally clear, and it's very stark. It's Hamas, it's Hezbollah, it's Iran. It's destruction, it's death, it's terrorism, it's darkness. So the more we are able to make real that first vision, the more I'm convinced that that's the vision that everyone, or virtually everyone, will subscribe to. So even as we are working through this challenge, this crisis, it's important to keep that vision alive, because it's important that people know that there is an alternative, and that everything that they hope for and that they aspire to is going to be best addressed through what I've just described, that first vision. We'll continue to do that.
Jennifer?
You have been listening to the Secretary of State speak to reporters at the State Department after the release of 2 American hostages, now former hostages, safe in Israel at this point, 2 women from Illinois, obviously here in the United States. I want to bring in our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who's been listening in with us. We know that members of the U.S. Embassy will see these former hostages at some point soon, Richard. We know that, as the Secretary laid out, some of, as he said, the 10 Americans still believed to be missing are being held by Hamas. And you also heard the Secretary go out of his way to thank Qatar for their role in helping to negotiate the release of these 2.
Well, I think you just said it. The key word there is some. And I think that indicates this chaotic situation that is going on in Gaza right now. That not all of the hostages, apparently, are being held by Hamas, that some of the Americans are being held by Hamas. We have to go back and remember how this attack unfolded at 6:30 in the morning on Saturday of the 7th. Hamas broke through the fence in roughly 30 different places surrounding the Gaza Strip, stormed into Israeli kibbutzes and communities, attacked that festival, that music festival, went on a killing spree, and took many hostages. While that fence was open, other Gazans crossed into Israel. Some of them stole tractors. Some of them went into homes to begin to loot. Some of them also took hostages. They brought them back into Gaza. There is a tremendous situation where Hamas does not even know how many Israelis and foreigners were brought into the Gaza Strip. So the situation is much more fluid in Gaza. Gaza is under attack, is under airstrikes. Hamas is now in hiding. It is moving from location to location. But the big thing today is at least these 2 Americans are now free.
Richard Engel, live for us there in Israel. Richard, we're glad to have you. Thank you. And thanks to all of our NBC News correspondents joining us for this special report. It has been a day and a night of fast-moving developments, and we'll have much more ahead on our streaming channel. I'll see you there in just a few on NBC News Now. We also have more online at NBCnews.com, and then the latest with tonight on Nightly News. I'm Hallie Jackson. Thank you so much for watching. See you soon.